I was sitting at the head of the boardroom table, on the 43rd floor of the building. My husband and I had built from nothing 26 years ago, with my lawyer on one side and the bankruptcy trustee on the other. And I had the pen in my hand, ready to sign away everything, when the door flew open, and this young waiter from the cafe, downstairs, the one I'd barely noticed, except for his kind eyes, walked in holding a folder and said, "Mrs. Richardson, you need to see this before you sign anything." And every single person in that room turned to stare at him, this 23-year-old kid in his coffee-stained apron, and I should have told him to leave. I should have called security. But something in his voice made me pause, and I said, "What is this?" And he said, "Proof that someone's been stealing from your company for the past 8 months." And everything stopped, because before I tell you how a waiter I'd never really talked to saved my entire life, hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because this story is about what happens when you lose everything. And the person who saves you is someone you never saw coming. So let me take you back 6 months to where this really started, because you need to understand how far I fell to understand how impossible it seemed that anyone, let alone him, could. Catch me 6 months ago. I was Victoria Richardson, 54 years old, CEO of Richardson Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity firm that my late husband Marcus and I had founded in 1998, and we'd grown it from a 2-person operation in our garage to a company worth $340 million with offices in 6 countries and 2,300 employees, and Marcus was the visionary, the tech genius, the one everyone loved, and I was the operations person, the one who made everything work, the one who handled the boring stuff like payroll and contracts, and keeping the lights on, and we were a perfect team until we weren't, until Marcus died 18 months ago of a brain aneurysm while giving a presentation at a tech conference in Singapore. And he just collapsed mid-sentence and was gone before the paramedics arrived. And suddenly, I wasn't part of a team anymore. I was alone running a company that felt too big, too complicated too. Everything without him. And I tried. I really did. I showed up. Every day I made decisions. I kept things moving. But inside, I was drowning. And the company started showing cracks. Clients left, competitors poached our best engineers. Our stock price dropped 30% in 6 months. And the board started having closed-door meetings without me. And I knew what that meant. They were losing faith in me. They thought I couldn't do this alone. And maybe they were right, because 3 months ago, our chief financial officer, Gerald Hoffman, came to my office and said, "Victoria, we need to talk about the numbers." And I said, "What about them?" And he showed me a spreadsheet and said, "We're burning through cash faster than projected. We've lost 4 major contracts this quarter, and if we don't turn this around, in the next 90 days, we're looking at bankruptcy." And I stared at those numbers, and I felt this wave of panic, because bankruptcy meant failure, meant losing everything. Marcus and I had built meant 2,300 people losing their jobs. And I said, "What do we do?" And Gerald said, "We need to cut costs, drastically layoffs, facility closures, maybe sell off some assets." And I said, "Do it, whatever it takes." And he did. We laid off 300 people. We closed 2 regional offices. We sold equipment and real estate. But it wasn't enough. The bleeding continued. And I couldn't figure out why our expenses were still too high, revenue was still dropping. And I was working 16-hour days trying to find the problem. but I couldn't see it. And then 60 days ago, one of our biggest clients, Meridian Financial, pulled their contract, worth $22 million a year. And they gave no real explanation, just said they were going in a different direction. And that was the domino that started everything falling. Because 2 weeks later, another major client left, then another, and our stock price crashed, and the board called an emergency meeting, and the chairman, Thomas Waverly, looked at me across that table and said, "Victoria, we need to discuss leadership transitions." And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "It means the board has lost confidence in your ability to steer this company through crisis, and we think it's time for new leadership." And I felt like I'd been punched, because new leadership meant me out. It meant they were taking away the last piece of Marcus I had left. And I said, "You're firing me." And Thomas said, "We're asking you to step aside voluntarily." And I said, "No." And he said, "Then we'll vote you out." And I said, "You can't. I still own 38%. And he said, "And 6 board members own 41% combined, and we will vote you out if necessary. Unless," and I said, "Unless what?" And all. He said, "Unless you agree to bring in a turnaround specialist, someone to co-manage with you." And I knew what that meant. A babysitter, someone to slowly push me out. And I said, "I need time to think." And he said, "You have 48 hours. And that meeting was on a Thursday. And I left that building, and I got in my car, and I drove, and I up at this little cafe 3 blocks from the office, a place I'd never been before. And I went in and sat in the corner booth, and I put my head in my hands, and I tried not to cry in public. And a voice said, "Are you okay?" And I looked up, and there was this young waiter, maybe early 20s, with dark curly hair and warm brown eyes and a concerned expression. And I said, "I'm fine." And he said, "You don't look fine." And I said, "I just need coffee." And he said, "Okay, but you look like you need more than more coffee. You look like you need someone to tell you it's going to be okay, even if you don't believe it yet." And something about his directness, his kindness, made my eyes well up. And I said, "I don't even know if that's true, if it will be okay." And he said, "Well, I don't know your situation, but I do know that most things that feel impossible at midnight feel slightly less impossible at sunrise. So maybe just try to make it to tomorrow and see." And I said, "That's oddly profound for a waiter." And he smiled and said, "I'm oddly profound for a lot of things." And then he brought me coffee and a piece of apple pie. I didn't order, and said, "It's on me." And I said, "You don't have to do that." And he said, "I know, but you look like you're carrying the world, and maybe pie helps." And I almost laughed, because pie definitely didn't help, but the gesture did. And then I said, "Thank you." And he said, "I'm James, by the way." And I said, "Victoria." And he said, "Nice to meet you, Victoria. I hope tomorrow's better." And then he left me alone. And I sat there, eating that pie and crying quietly. And I didn't know then that James would become the most important person in my life. I didn't know that this random act of kindness was the beginning of everything. And over the next month, I went back to that cafe 3 or 4 times a week, always sitting in the same corner booth, always ordering coffee, and James always served me. And we talked just small talk at first about weather and books and how the cafe's pastries were better than they had any right to be. But slowly, the conversations got deeper. I told him I was struggling at work, though. I didn't give details, and he told me he dropped out of college 2 years ago when his mom got sick, and he'd been working 2 jobs to pay her medical bills. And she died 6 months ago, and now he was trying to figure out what came next. I said, I'm sorry about your mom. And he said, I'm sorry about whatever's making you look so tired all the time. And I said, it's complicated. And he said, most important, things are. And there was something about him, something steady and genuine that made me want to be around him. And I started timing my cafe visits for his shifts, and I told myself it was just because he was nice, because the cafe was quiet, because needed a break from the office. But the truth was, I looked forward to seeing James. I looked forward to our conversations, to the way he looked at me, like I was just Victoria, not the CEO, not the widow, not the woman who was failing, just me. And then, 45 days ago, the board gave me their ultimatum: accept a co-CEO or be voted out. And I accepted, because what choice did I have? And they brought in this guy, Derek Chen, hotshot consultant, who'd turned around 3 companies. And he walked into my office like he owned it and said, Victoria, I've reviewed your financials and you've made some critical errors. And I said, like what? And he said, your cost cutting was reactive, not strategic. You've been so focused on saving the company, you haven't asked why it's failing in the first place. And I said, what does that mean? And he said it means something. Doesn't. Tad up your revenue drop is too steep. Your expense increases are inconsistent. And I think someone's cooking the books. And I said, that's impossible. Gerald's been with us for 12 years. And Derek said, how long has Marcus been dead? And I said, 18 months. And he said, and how carefully have you been watching the finances? And I said, not as carefully as I should have been. I trusted Gerald and Derek. Said trust is how embezzlement happens. And I said, you think Gerald's stealing from us? And he said, I think someone is, but I need time to prove it. And I said, how much time? And he said, weeks, maybe months. And I said, we don't have months. We have maybe 30 days before we run out of cash. And he said, then we buy time, we borrow, we sell more. Assets, we do whatever it takes. But if someone's stealing, we need to catch them before they disappear. And that conversation happened on a Wednesday. And on Thursday, I went to the cafe. And I must have looked worse than usual, because James took one look at me and said, rough day. And I said, you have no idea. And he said, you want to talk about it? And I said, I can't. It's work stuff. And he said, okay, then let's talk about something else. And he sat down across from me, which he'd never done before, and said, tell me something good, something that has nothing to do with work. And I said, I can think of anything. And he said, come on, there must be something. And I thought about it. And I said, I have a garden at my house. And sometimes when I'm there early in morning, before the sun's fully up, it's quiet and still. And for just a minute, I forget about everything else. And he said, that sounds nice. And I said, it is. And he said, you should do that more often. Forget about everything else. And I said, I don't. That luxury. And he said, everyone has that luxury, Victoria. They just have to choose it. And I said, you make it sound simple. And he said, it is simple, people. Just make it complicated. And I said, how old are you? And he said, 23. And I said, you're very wise for 23. And he said, my mom used to say, pain ages you. faster than time. And I've had a lot of pain. So maybe I'm older than I look. And something about that conversation about him sitting across from me in that empty cafe at his 2 in the afternoon made me see him differently, not just as the nice waiter, but as a person. Someone real, someone who'd suffered and survived. And I said, thank you for this. And he said, for what? And I said, for reminding me that there's more to life than spreadsheets and board meetings. And he said, anytime, and then his manager called him back to work. And he left. And I sat there thinking about him, thinking about how easy it was to talk to him. And I told myself, it was just friendship, just human connection in a lonely time. But part of me knew it was becoming something else, and I tried to push that part down because I was 54 and he was 23 and I was his customer and he was being nice, and reading anything else into it was ridiculous. Except it didn't feel ridiculous. It felt like the first real thing I'd felt in 18 months, and 2 weeks later, everything accelerated. Came to me and said, I found it. And I said, found what? And he said, the embezzlement Gerald's been skimming. For 8 months, he's created fake vendor accounts and been funneling money to offshore accounts. And I said, how much? And he said, so far we've tracked $4.2 million. And I felt sick because $4.2 million and Gerald someone, Marcus trusted someone I trusted. And I said, why? And Derek said, probably because he knew the company was vulnerable after Marcus died, and he thought he could get away with it. And I said, what do we do? And he said, we call the police, we file charges. We try to recover what we can. But Victoria, even if we get it all back, the damage is done. Clients left because Gerald was sabotaging us, feeding information to competitors. And we're too far gone to save this. And I said, what are you saying? And he said, I am saying we're looking at bankruptcy. And I said, no, there has to be another way. And he said, there isn't. I'm sorry. And I said, how long? And he said, days, maybe a week. And that night, I didn't go home. I stayed in my office and I went through every file, every contract, every possibility, trying to find a way to save this. And at 2 a.m., I was still there, and I was so tired, I could barely see straight, and my assistant, Rachel, knocked on the door and said, Victoria, go home. And I said, I can't. And she said, you have to. You're going to collapse. And I said, let me collapse after I figure this out. And she said, there's nothing to figure out. Derek's right. It's over. And I said, I can't let it be over, Rachel. I can't lose this. And she said, you already have. And those words broke something in me. And I started crying, really crying for the first time since Marcus died. And Rachel sat with me and held my hand and said, it's not your fault. And I said, yes, it is. I should have seen it. I should have been paying attention. And she said, you were grieving, Victoria. No one expected you to be perfect. And I said, the board did, the employees did. And she said, they're wrong. And I said, that doesn't matter. Wrong doesn't save the company. And she said, no, but maybe it's time to let go. And I said, I don't know how. And she said, one day at a time. And the next morning, I went to the cafe, and James took one look at me and said, okay, what happened? And I said, my company's going bankrupt. And he said, what? And I said, I'm about to lose everything, and I don't know how to stop it. And he said, do you want to stop it? And I said, of course I want to stop it. And he said, then you will. And I said, it says not that simple. And he said, why not? And I said, because I don't have the money, the resources, the time. And he said, so find them. And I said, from where? And he said, I don't know, Victoria, but you're one of the smartest people I've ever met. And if anyone can figure this out, it's you. And I said, you don't even know me. And he said, I know you well enough to know you don't give up. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, because you come here every week looking like you're about to break, but you never do. You keep showing up. And that takes strength. And I said, or stupidity. And he said, no, it's strength. And I wanted to believe him. I really did, but I couldn't. And 3 days later, the board called a meeting and Thomas said, Victoria, we need to discuss filing for Chapter 11. And I said no. And he said, it's not optional. We're out of options. The creditors are circling. And if we don't file, we'll be forced into Chapter 7 liquidation. And at least with Chapter 11, we can try to reorganize. And I said, give me one more week. And he said, to do what? And I said, to figure something out. And he said, there's nothing to figure out. And I said, please, Thomas, 1 week. And he looked around. The table and the other board members were shaking their heads. And he said, Victoria, I'm sorry, but we're voting today. And I said, then I vote no. And he said, and you'll be outvoted 6-1. And I said, so that's it. You're just giving up. And he said, we're realistic. And I said, realistic feels a lot like cowardice. And Thomas's face went red. And he said, we gave you every chance we brought in, Derek. We tried to help you. And you refuse to see that this company is dying. And I said, because Marcus and I built this from nothing. And he said, and now it's nothing again. That's how business works sometimes. And I said, get out. And he said, excuse me. And I said, all of you, get out. I need a minute. And they hesitated. And I said, now. And they left. And I sat there alone in that boardroom. And I felt like I was drowning, like the walls were closing in. And I called Rachel and said, schedule the bankruptcy filing for Friday morning. And she said, Victoria, are you sure? And I said, no, but I don't have a choice. And she said, okay, I'll set it up. And I hung up and I left the office and I went to the cafe. And it was late afternoon, almost closing time. And James was wiping down tables and he saw me and said, hey. And I said, hey. And he said, you look terrible. And I said, I feel terrible. And he said what happened. And I told him everything about Gerald, about the embezzlement, about the board meeting, about the bankruptcy filing on Friday. And he listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he said, so you're giving up? And I said, I'm not giving up. I'm accepting reality. And he said, those sound like the same thing. And I said, well, they're not. And he said, okay, then fight. And I said, I don't know how to fight this, James. I don't have weapons. And he said, yes, you do. You have your brain, your experience, your determination. And I said, that's not enough. And he said, how do you know if you haven't tried? And I said, I have tried. I've tried everything. And he said, everything. And I said, yes, everything. And he said, have you looked at the raw financial data yourself? Or did you let other people summarize it for you? And I stopped because I'd been relying on Derek and Gerald before him to present the numbers. And James said, that's what I thought. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, it means you're so used to delegating that you stop doing the work yourself. And maybe if you went back to basics, looked at everything with fresh eyes, you'd see something everyone else missed. And I said, James, you're a waiter, not a business consultant. And he said, you're right, I'm a waiter, which means I spend my days watching people. And I've learned that most people miss what's right in front of them because they're not actually looking. And I said, and you think I'm missing something? And he said, I think you won't know until you look. And something about the way he said it, so confident, so certain, made me want to believe him. And I said, okay. And he said, okay, what? And I said, okay, I'll look, but I need help. And he said, what kind of help? And I said, someone to go through numbers with me, someone who won't have preconceptions. And he said, I can do that. And I said, James, you work 2 jobs. And he said, I'll make time. And I said, why would you do this? And he said, because you need help. And I said, you barely know me. And he said, I know you well enough. And that night, James came to my office after his shift ended at 11 p.m. And I had spreadsheets everywhere, financial reports, contracts, invoices. And he looked at it all and said, okay, where do we start? And I said, I don't know. And he said, then let's start at the beginning. When did things start going wrong? And I said, about 8 months ago. And he said, okay, show me the financials from 8 months ago. And I pulled them up, and we started going through line by line. And it was tedious, boring work. And at one point, around 3 a.m., I said, you can leave if you want. And he said, I'm not leaving. And I said, James, you must be exhausted. And he said, so are you. But you're not leaving either. And I said, this is my company. And he said, and you're my friend. And I stopped because he'd never called me his friend before. And I said, is that what we are, friends? And he looked at me and said, I don't know, Victoria. What do you want us to be? And the question hung in the air. And I knew I should say friends. I should establish that boundary. But instead, I said, I don't know either. And he said, okay, then let's just be whatever. And we went back to the numbers. And around 5 a.m., James stopped and said, wait. And I said, what? And he said, this invoice from a vendor called Apex Solutions for $78,000. What's that for? And I said, I don't know. Let me check. And I pulled up the vendor file. And it was legitimate, or it looked legitimate. And I said, it's for server maintenance. And he said, okay. And when's the next invoice? And I pulled up the next month. And there was another invoice from Apex for 80%, $1,000. And then another the month after for $74,000. And James said that's almost $250,000 in 3 months for server maintenance. And I said, is that unusual? And he said, I don't know. Is it? And I called our director at 5:45 a.m. And he answered groggily and said, Victoria, what wrong? And I said, do we use a vendor called Apex Solutions? And he said, no, I've never heard of them. We do our own server maintenance in-house. And my stomach dropped. And I said, are you sure? And he said, yes, I'm sure. Why? And I said, I'll call you back. And I hung up. And I looked at James and said, Apex doesn't exist. And he said, or it, but it's not providing any services. And I said, which means? And he said, which means someone's stealing. And it's not just Gerald. And we spent the next hour finding more fake vendors, more fraudulent invoices. And by the time the sun came up, we'd found $2.7 million in additional theft beyond what Derek had uncovered. And I said, I need to call Derek, and James said no. And I said, what do you mean no? And he said, if Derek missed this much, maybe he missed it on purpose. And I said, you think Derek's involved? And he said, I think you shouldn't trust anyone until, for sure. And I said, then what do I do? And he said, you go to the police directly. You bypass everyone, and you make sure this gets investigated properly. And I said, okay. And he said, and you postpone the bankruptcy filing. And I said, I can't, the board already voted. And he said, the board doesn't know about this new evidence. And if there's 2.7 million more to recover, that changes the math. And I said, maybe. And he said, Victoria, this is your company, fight for it. And I looked at him, this 23-year-old waiter, who'd spent the entire night helping me who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And I said, okay, I'll fight. And he smiled, said, good. And I said, thank you, James. And he said, for what? And I said, for caring. And he said, that's easy to do. And I said, why? And he said, because you're easy to care about. And something about the way he said it made my heart skip. And I said, James, I'm 31 years older than you. And he said, I know. And I said this, whatever this is between us can't go anywhere. And he said, why not? And I said, because I'm your customer. I'm old enough to be your mother. People would judge. And he said, do you care what people think? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, why? And I said, because I've spent my whole life building a reputation. And he said, and how's that reputation working out for that one you right now? And I didn't have an answer. And he said, Victoria, I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you that I care about you, and that's not going to change, regardless of what you do with that information. And then he left, and I sat there, feeling things I had no business feeling, and I called the police, and I filed a report. And I called Thomas and said, we need to postpone the bankruptcy filing there. New evidence of embezzlement. And he said, what evidence? And I told him, and there was silence. And then he said, how did you find this? And I said, I looked. And he said, Derek looked. And I said, clearly not carefully enough. And Thomas said, I'll call an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. And I said, good. And he said, Victoria, if this pans out, if there's really this much more to recover, then maybe. And I said, maybe what? And he said, maybe we were wrong about you. And I said, yes, you were. And I hung up. And the board meeting that afternoon was tense. Thomas was there. Derek was there, the other board members. And I presented everything James and I had found. And Derek's face went white, and he said, I don't understand how I missed this. And I said, that's a good question, Derek. How did you miss $2.7 million in fake invoices? And he said, I was focused on Gerald's theft. I didn't think to look broader. And I said, or you were covering for someone. And he said, what are you accusing me of? And I said, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking how a professional turnaround consultant missed something this obvious. And Thomas said, Victoria, that's enough. And I said, no, it's not enough, Derek. Either you're incompetent or you're complicit. And either way, I want you gone. And Thomas said, we'll investigate, Derek. But right now, the priority is recovery. And I said, agreed. And he said, and if we can recover this, money. And if we can stabilize the company, then what? And I said, then I stay on as a CEO alone. No co-manager. No oversight. Just me and Thomas looked around the table and said we'll vote on that when we know more. But Victoria, you've earned the right to try. And that was as close to an apology as I was going to get. And over the next 2 weeks, the police investigation moved fast. They arrested Gerald. They arrested 3 other employees who were involved. And they froze accounts and started recovery proceedings. And Derek was cleared of involvement. He really had just been incompetent. But I still had him removed because I didn't trust him. And slowly the company started to stabilize. We recovered $1.8 million immediately with more coming. And I renegotiated payment terms with our creditors. And I called our former clients and explained what had happened, that we'd been sabotaged, and several of them agreed to come back. And our stock price started climbing, and the board meeting 3 weeks after that night with James was different. Thomas started by saying, Victoria, we owe you an apology. And I said, yes, you do. And he said, we lost faith in you. And we were wrong. And I said, yes, you were. And he said, we'd like to reinstate you as sole CEO with full authority. And I said, I accept. And he said, there's one condition. And I said, what? And he said, you bring in a new CFO, someone we all trust. And I said, agreed. Gerald's position has been vacant anyway. And he said, good. And then he said, how did you figure this out when no one else could? And I said, I had help. And he said and I thought about James, about those long nights in my office, about how he'd believed in me. And I said, from someone who taught me to look at things differently. And Thomas said, well, whoever they are, we owe them a debt of gratitude. And I said, yes, we do. And after that meeting, I went to the cafe, and James was there, and I said, we need to talk. And he said, okay. And I said, not here, somewhere private. And he said, okay, when's your shift end? And he said, in an hour. And I said, I'll wait. And I sat in my usual booth. And I watched him work, and I thought about what I was about to do. And when his shift ended, we went to my car, and I drove us to my house, and he said, nice place. And I said, thank you. Marcus designed it, and he said, Marcus, your husband and I said yes. And he said, you still love him? And I said, I always will. But he's gone, and I have to figure out how to live without him. And James said, that sounds lonely. And I said, it is. And he said, it doesn't have to be. And I said, James, I need to tell you something. And he said, okay. And I said, you saved my company. You saved my life. And I don't know how to thank you. And he said, you don't have to thank me. And I said, yes, I do. And he said, Victoria, you're the one who did the work. I just helped you see it. And I said, you were more than help you were. And I stopped because I didn't know how to finish that sentence. And he said, I was what? And I said, you were the only person who believed in me. And he said, that's not true. Rachel believed in you. And I said, Rachel believed I should give up. You believed I should fight. And he said, because I saw something in you that you couldn't see yourself. And I said, what did you see? And he said, strength and intelligence and determination and beauty. And that last word hung between us. And I said, James, you can't say things like that. And he said, why not? And I said, because it makes this complicated. And he said, this was already complicated. And I said, we can't do this. And he said, why not? And I said, because you're 23. And I'm 54 because I'm a CEO and you're a waiter. Because people will judge because it's wrong. And he said wrong, according to who? And I said according to society. And he said society doesn't get a vote in my life. And I said, but it gets a vote in mine. And he said, then, whose opinion matters more, theirs or yours? And I said, I don't know. And he said, yes, you do. And then he kissed me, and I should have stopped. Him? I should have pulled away, but I didn't. I kissed him back, and it felt like waking up after a long sleep. And when we broke apart, I said, this is a mistake. And he said, maybe, but it's a mistake I want to make. And I said, James, I could ruin your life. And he said, or you could make it better. And I said, you don't know what you're asking for. And he said, I'm not asking for anything, Victoria. I'm offering. And I said, offering? What? And he said, myself, whatever you want, however you want it. And I said, I can't give you a future. I can't give you marriage or children or any of the things you should have. And he said, I don't want those things, I want you. And I said, you say that now, but? And he said, but nothing. I know what I want. And I said, and if you change your mind? And he said, then I'll tell you, but I won't. And I said, how do you know? And he said, because I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I said, we barely know each other. And he said, I know enough. And I said, James, this is insane. And he said, probably, but I don't care. And I said, I care. And he said, then stop caring. And I said, I can't. And he said, yes, you can. You just have to choose to. And I looked at him and I saw something in his eyes. Something real and certain and terrifying. And I said, if we do this, it has to be private. No one can know. And he said, okay. And I said, I'm serious. James, my reputation, my company, everything could be at risk. And he said, I understand. And I said, do you really? Because if this gets out, people will say terrible things. They'll say, I'm taking advantage of you. They'll say, I'm desperate. They'll say, and he kissed me again and said, I don't care what they say. And I said, but I do. And he said, then we'll be careful. And I said, okay. And he said, okay. And that was the beginning. And for the next 3 months, James and I were together in secret. He'd come to my house late at night, after his shifts, and we'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. And he made me laugh in ways I hadn't laughed in years. And he made me feel young and alive and desired. And I fell in love with him, slowly, then, all at once. And I tried to fight it. I tried to tell myself this was temporary, that eventually he'd wake up and realize what a mistake he was making. But he never did. He stayed. And he loved me with an intensity that scared me, because I didn't know if I deserved it, and I didn't know how to handle it. And then 4 months after we'd started seeing each other, Rachel, my assistant, called me on a Saturday morning and said, Victoria, we have a problem. And I said, what kind of problem? And she said, someone sent photos to the board. And I said, photos of what? And she said, photos of you and James. And my blood went cold. And I said, what? And she said, there are pictures of him leaving your house late at night, pictures of you two in your car. And someone sent them to Thomas with a note saying the CEO is having an inappropriate relationship. subordinate. And I said, subordinate. He's not my employee. And she said, they're saying he is because he works at the cafe you frequent and you've given him money. And I said, I gave him money as thanks for helping me. That's not employment. And she said, Victoria, that's not how it looks. And I said, who sent the photos? And she said, I don't know. But Thomas is calling an emergency board meeting for Monday. And I said, okay. And she said, Victoria, this is bad. And I said, I know. And I hung up. And I called James and said, we need to talk. And he came over and I told him and he said, okay, so we tell them the truth. And I said the truth that I'm in a relationship with someone 31 years younger than me. And he said, yes. And I said, James, they'll use this against me. They'll say I'm unfit to lead. They'll say I have poor judgment. And he said, then let them say it. And I said, I can't lose this company again. And he said, you won, Tat. And I said, how do you know? And he said, because you didn't do anything wrong. Loving someone isn't wrong. And I said it is when that someone is you. And he said, why? Because I'm young. Because I'm poor. Because I don't fit their idea of who you should be with. And I said all of those things, yes. And he said, Victoria, if they fire you over this, then they're the ones with poor judgment, not you. And I said, that doesn't matter. The result is the same. I lose everything. And he said, then maybe it's time to choose what matters more, the company or us. And I said, that's not fair. And he said, nothing about this is fair, but you still have to choose. And I said, I can't. And he said, yes, you can. And I said, James, if I choose you, I lose my life's work. And he said, and if you choose the company, you lose me. Is that really a better option? And I didn't know how to answer. And the board meeting on Monday was brutal. Thomas opened by saying, Victoria, we've received troubling information about your personal life. And I said, aye, aware. And he said, care to explain? And I said, I'm in a relationship with someone. And he said, with James Morrison, a 23-year-old waiter. And I said, yes. And one of the board members, Margaret, said, Victoria, this is completely inappropriate. And I said, why? And she said, because of the age difference, the power dynamic, the optics. And I said, there's no power dynamic. He doesn't work for me. And she said, you've given him money. You've used your position too. And I said, I gave him money as thanks for saving this company. And Thomas said, that's another thing. How exactly did a waiter with no business experience uncover fraud that our CFO missed? And I said he looked at the data with fresh eyes, and he saw patterns others missed. And Thomas said, or you fed him information to make him look good so you could justify your relationship. And I said, that's absurd. And he said, is it because from where we're sitting this looks like a woman having a midlife crisis and making increasingly poor decisions? And I stood up and said, that's enough. And Thomas said, sit down, Victoria. And I said, no, I won't sit down while you insult me. And Thomas said, then leave. And I said, fine. And I walked out. And when I got to my car, James was there. And I said, what are you doing here? And he said, I came to support you. And I said, you can't be here. And he said, why not? And I said, because it makes everything worse. And he said, worse than them? Accusing you of corruption because of me. And I said, yes. And he said, Victoria, I'm not going to hide. And I said, you have to. And he said, no, I don't. And neither do you. I said, James, please, you don't understand what's at stake. And he said, I understand perfectly. You're willing to sacrifice us to keep a company that's treated you like garbage. And I said, they're treating me like garbage because of you. And the words were out before I could stop them. And his face went pale. And he said, so this is my fault. And I said, I didn't mean it like that. And he said, yes, you did. And maybe you're right. Maybe I am the problem. And he turned to leave, and I grabbed his arm and said, James, wait. And he said, what? And I said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. And he said, yeah, you did. And I said, okay, maybe I did. But I'm scared, James. I'm scared of losing everything. And he said, you already lost everything, Victoria. You just haven't admitted it yet. And he left. And I sat in my car, and I cried because he was right. I'd been so focused on saving the company that I'd lost sight of what actually mattered. And that night, I got a call from Thomas. And he said, Victoria, the board has voted. And I said, voted on what? And he said, on your future with the company. And I said, and he said, we're giving you two options, resign voluntarily, or we'll vote you out. And you'll lose your severance. And I said, after everything I've done for this company, you're firing me over who I love. And he said, we're firing you for poor judgment. And I said, that's the same thing. And he said, Victoria, you brought this on yourself. And I said, no, you brought this on me. Because you couldn't handle a woman being in charge after her husband died. And Thomas said, that's not true. And I said, isn't it? You've been looking for an excuse to get rid of me since Marcus died. And my relationship with James gave you that excuse. And Thomas was quiet. And I said, I'll resign, but I want my full severance and equity. And he said, agreed. And I said, and I want it in writing. He said, you'll have it by tomorrow. And I hung up. And I called James and said, I resigned. And he said, what? And I said, I quit. And he said, why? And I said, because I chose you. And there was silence. And then he said, Victoria, you didn't have to do that. And I said, yes, I did. Because you were right. The company doesn't matter if I don't have you. And he said, are you sure? And I said, no, but I'm doing it anyway. And he said, I love you. And I said, I love you too. And those were the first times we'd said it. And it felt like jumping off a cliff. And the next few months were hard. I had money from my severance, but I didn't have purpose. I didn't have a job. I didn't have the company that had defined me for 26 years. And I struggled. I really did. I went through periods where I questioned everything, where I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But James stayed. He moved in with me, and he kept working at the cafe. And he started taking online business classes. And he had this dream of opening his own restaurant someday. And I helped him with business plans and financing. And it gave me something to do, something to care about. And slowly, I started to build a new life. I started consulting for other companies, helping them with operations and fraud prevention. And I was good at it. And people hired me because of my reputation, because I'd survived a scandal and come out stronger. And James and I were happy. We were really happy in a way I'd never been with Marcus. Because with Marcus, everything was about the company. But with James, everything was about us, about building a life together. And yes, People judged us, people still do when we're out together. I see the looks, the whispers, but I don't care anymore because I learned that other people's opinions don't pay. My bills don't keep me warm at night, don't make me happy. And James, he makes me deliriously happy. And 6 months after I resigned from Richardson Tech, the board reached out and said, "Victoria, we made a mistake." And I said, "Yes, you did." And they said, "We want you to come back as a consultant." And I said, "No." And they said, "We'll pay you double your old salary." And I said, "I don't care about the money." And they said, "Then what do you care about?" And I said, "I care about being with people who value me, and you don't." And they said, "We value you now." And I said, "Too little, too late." And I hung up. And James said, "Are you sure about that?" And I said, "Yes, because Richardson Tech is my past, and you're my future." And he smiled and said, "Good." And then he said, "I have something to ask you." And I said, "Okay." And he got down on one knee. And I said, "James, what are you doing?" And he said, "Marrying you if you'll have me." And I said, "You want to marry me?" And he said, "More than anything." And I said, "James, we've only been together for 10 months. And he said, "I don't need more time. I know what I want." And I said, "People will talk." And he said, "Let them." And I said, "I'm 55 and you're 24. And he said, "And I love you anyway." And I said, "You're supposed to marry someone your own age, someone who can give you children, someone who..." And he said, "Victoria, will you marry me, yes or no?" And I said, "Yes." And he kissed me, and we got married 3 months later in a small ceremony with just a few friends. And my daughter Amy flew in from Seattle. And she met James. And afterwards, she pulled me aside and said, "Mom, are you happy?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Then I'm happy for you." And I said, "Even though he's younger than you." And she said, "Even though, because I've never seen you look like this." And I said, "Like what?" And she said, "Like, you're actually living instead of just surviving." And I hugged her and I cried because she was right for the first time. In years, I was living. And now it's been 2 years since that night when James walked into my boardroom with that folder. 2 years since he saved my company and my life. And he's 26 now. And I'm 56. And we're still together, still happy, still building our life. And he opened his restaurant last year, a small place that serves comfort food and coffee, and it's doing well. And I'm still consulting, and sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if I hadn't met James, if I'd signed those bankruptcy papers, if I'd given up. And I know with certainty that I wouldn't have survived. Not really. I would have gone through the motions, but I wouldn't have lived. And James taught me how to live again, how to take risks, how to fight for what matters. And yes, he saved my company, but more importantly, he saved me. And if you are still watching this, if you've made it this far, I want you to know that it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to choose love over fear, to choose happiness over reputation, to choose life over survival. And sometimes the person who saves you is the person you least expect. And that's okay, because salvation doesn't come with prerequisites. It just comes. And you can either accept it or you can let it pass you by. And I'm so grateful I accepted it. I'm so grateful for James, for his kindness, his wisdom, his love. And if this story touched you, if it made you think about your own life and the choices you're making, leave a comment below and tell me what you choose if you had to decide between security and love, between reputation and happiness. Because I chose love, and I've never regretted it, not for a single second.